So again, welcome. My name is Julie Lewis. I am the site director for C.R.E.A.T.E Community Studios in Saratoga Springs. We also have a studio in Schenectady. And for those of you that aren't familiar with us, we are a Capital District nonprofit with a mission to make art accessible to as many people in our communities as possible. Art can often be expensive or limiting, or sometimes people can feel that, you know, if they don't have the right kind of training, they can't participate in art. And so our goal is to help people find their voice and use the expressive arts for personal growth and transformation and bringing community together. We do a lot of public art programs. We also have programs in studio, and we've been doing lots of stuff online since the pandemic. And this is for both adults and children, all ages. We try to specialize in bringing art to underserved communities. So we do a lot of work with other nonprofits in the area. In Saratoga, we work with Healing Springs, Wellspring, Captains, Shelters of Saratoga, Franklin Community Center, Saratoga Springs City Public Housing Communities to bring free art programs to those populations. So we love what we do, and we're glad you're here. So we are doing a watercolor basics class tonight. And you should have, hopefully, if you didn't yet, there may still be some available. There were about 12 kits available of watercolor tubes. And I chose to use watercolor tubes because that's sort of like the mystery thing for people. Most people have seen, like, they have their kids' Crayola watercolor pan, or something really simple and basic, which is absolutely fine for this class. But I thought that for those of you that have never tried watercolors from a tube, that can be a little trickier because you're doing a little more mixing. So part of what we're going to be learning is the right ratio of paint to water, etc. So I am going to be throughout the class sharing my screen. And I do see when things come up in the chat, but I can't see. It's hard for me to be paying attention to both. So if you have a question, you can either raise your hand so that I know I'll see that pop up in the window, or type it in the chat, and Jen will let me know as we go along where we are at with questions. So I'm going to share my screen. And we're just going to be going through a brief presentation here. It's going to be sort of ongoing between a PowerPoint and my overhead camera so that you can see what my hands are doing while we work. So simple watercolor techniques for beginners is where we're at today. And these are the materials that you should have out in front of you right now. So you want your watercolor tubes, you want your, if you have any kind of a palette, now in the kit, there's a simple palette like this. In a moment, you'll see I have a larger palette that has mixing stations off to the side. If you don't have that, any ceramic plate will work. Don't use paper because obvious reasons, the water is going to absorb into the paper. And so you want to avoid using anything that is paper as a palette. Or you want a plastic or a ceramic surface to mix your paint on. You're also going to want your brushes. Again, in your kit, there were several brushes. Sable brushes are best, but they're very expensive. So for the purpose of the kit, we gave everybody beginner brushes that will work absolutely fine. But if this is something that you get interested in and a little more curious about various brushes, downtown at Suave Fair, they are very helpful and have an incredible brush selection. So you can go in there and ask lots of questions. You want a little pot of water nearby. I like to use little recycled yogurt containers or whatever, and I just pop my brushes and my water in there. You also got some watercolor sheets in your bag, and watercolor paper comes in various weights, and the reason is that it interacts differently with paint and water. So the lighter the paper, obviously it won't absorb as much, and the thicker the paper, you have a little more absorption, and you'll also see a little more texture with thicker paper. So you were given a medium weight watercolor paper for today's class. You're also going to want a little towel. I use, like I cut up leftover t-shirts and use those because those are great for this purpose, or little shop towels. Paper towels are fine. Your palette. I suggest we're going to do one particular technique where we use table salt. So I just have like a kosher or a sea salt in a little bowl nearby. That's not necessary if you don't have it nearby, but even if you have your shaker, your salt shaker nearby, you can grab that. We're also going to be using a white crayon or oil pastel. Again, not totally necessary for tonight because I'll do the demonstration and you can see it. But if you do have a white crayon or a white oil pastel, you can use that. Not a chalk pastel, also known as dry pastels, but oil. And a thin line permanent marker or any kind of permanent marker. I like to use Micron pens. They come in various widths. This one is a 0.5, and that's a very fine point. You'll see that I like to use it to create detail and kind of contrast between my colors and the drawing that I might be filling in. So I will show you in a moment here what my setup at my desk looks like. So I'm right-handed, so I want and again, this is, you're going to figure this out for yourself how it feels good, but I'll show you my setup. I put my water directly in front of me on top of my towel, and I put my paints and my palette to the right of me because I'm right-handed. So I want everything to kind of flow from left to right. So water, towel, paint. Because that's often the order that you're going to be going in. And you want to be careful not to have the water on this side and the paint on this side and then be dragging water and paint across your paper. So that's the reason why I'm a little bit specific about the setup, because when things are in front of you, you can kind of make an L and avoid trying to get stuff on your paper that you might not want on there. Okay, so to set up for our class tonight, because we're going to try 6 different techniques that I'm going to teach you, 6 different techniques, you're going to want to take your Sharpie marker and just make 6 rectangles on your paper. And this is how I did mine. They don't have to be perfect. These ones that you see in my picture are, I measured them with my ruler. You don't have to do that. This is another really simple way to do this, okay? So just drawing 6 rectangles, and we're going to be labeling them. So I will show you the label in just a moment. I'm going to screen share my... While you're making your 6 rectangles, I am getting my overhead camera set up, so thank you for your patience. This takes a moment sometimes to get to that. Okay. Sorry, one moment. I'm just going to get my camera open. Okay, Jenna, are we good so far on any questions about setup?
We are good. No questions yet.
Okay. All right. I need to move this guy over here. I'm still kind of learning the whole document camera thing, so I appreciate your patience with it, because one thing that's a little weird is getting the right angle for everything so that you can kind of see what I'm doing. So I'm going to move my water and my palette out of the way. So you're not going to see that, just so that you can see this. Okay. All right. So that works a little bit better. Okay. So this is my setup here. And I'm just going to go through labeling these for you. And then I'm going to walk through and explain what each one is, and we're going to try them out together. Okay, so your first box is going to be wet on wet. Your second box is wet on dry. Your third box is called Building Up Color. And again, I've done this with a Sharpie because we're going to be painting over it. If you're not using a Sharpie, just mark it underneath so that you don't lose the name of what you're working on. Fourth box is Creating Gradients. The fifth box is called Getting Precise. And the sixth box is Mixing Color. Okay, so let's go through our first wet on wet. You're going to select a brush. I'm going back to my PowerPoint here, so thanks. I just get all my screens up so I can toggle back and forth. Okay. So for our wet on wet, you're going to get your brush wet. So you're just putting your brush in the water. I have actually several brushes in my water right now. For this one, we're going to use a large brush. If you have a choice of several brushes, choose a brush that's fairly large, not your biggest brush if you have something like this. Round brushes are what we typically use for watercolor. So this is a rounded, it often looks like it has a ponytail or something on it. It's the tip of a ponytail. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through this and then I'm going to show you each demonstration. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is get some paint in our pan. So go ahead and choose a color. This is not, this is however, there's no particular order to the color that we're going to use today. So you can just start with your favorite, and I'm going to put a tiny bit in my pan here. And what you'll notice is that it comes out kind of liquidy, like toothpaste, right? It should not be too smooth, too thin, because we will end up mixing some of that later. If you're using a standard watercolor pan where the colors are already dry, you don't have to do anything because your colors are there already, okay? So I'm going to get a lot of water on my brush, and I'm going to fill in that first box right here, wet on wet, with water. Just water, no color, okay? I know that sounds a little strange, but you're not, because you're not going to see anything, but you're just going to do water, water, water all over it. So you have a very thick layer of water over the top, okay? The next thing we're going to do is dab our brush. We want to dry it off a little bit. We want to dab our brush into our color, our chosen color, with just a little tiny bit on the tip. So not a whole lot, okay? If it's the liquid tube color, you're going to actually see a little bit of color on the tip, like this. If you have the dry color palette, it'll be on your brush. And then we're just going to start dabbing it into the water. And what you'll notice is the process of what we call transference, okay? So transference means when a color or water moves, right? This is like the principle of how plants take up water and distribute it throughout the plant system, and kind of how our body uses water too, right? So we often use this technique for doing either a simple wash in the background, a landscape or a sky, something that is a little bit in the background and slightly sort of flowy looking. Okay, so you'll see I have an example right here on the right-hand side, and I'm going to switch my screen so that you can see my process as I do it overhead. Okay, so here's my wet on wet. I already started a little bit with a little bit of red paint. I really love the process of mixing, so you'll see this was an example I worked on earlier today. So mixing red and blue, we get into a little bit of color mixing theory here, will make purple. So sometimes I like to play with color mixing with this kind of procedure because you will see the colors flow from one into the other. And this is like a really relaxing type of technique for watercolor. So I'm going to use my blue next. I'm just getting a little bit of water on my brush now because the square is still very wet. I'm going to get a little bit of my blue. Now my watercolors have dried up. Here's something to just kind of take note. You don't have to toss your watercolor. This is a palette that I just keep coming back to. So the watercolor from the tube will dry up. It's not a problem. You can reconstitute it with water. And now if I start dabbing next to my red, alongside my red, you can start to see the two kind of transfer into one another, and the colors will start kind of mixing where they meet, right? So wet on wet is a very, it's a fun and abstract way to kind of play with the color mixing, but also to just kind of enjoy watching the colors flow. Now I just got a little more water on my brush because I want to spread these dots out. I don't love the effect of it looking kind of polka dotted. I want it to move more. So you can see that my paint is starting to move as I add more water. And it will stop where the barrier of water ends. So that's what's kind of cool, is you will have a buildup of water at some point, and it will actually kind of create this cool sort of bled out pattern right there, that texture. And if you don't like the amount of water that's on there, this is why I love shop towels. I take my shop towel and I can just kind of gently dab on top, and I can remove some of that color. And then what I have left behind is the heavier pigment, okay? So just take a moment and kind of play with putting some colors. And again, you can just put more water down after you dab. In this way, you know, some people think watercolors are hard because you have to be very precise, and they are difficult because they do bleed. But I actually love that quality. I love that there's so much color moving from one thing into the next all the time. So I'm going to try maybe adding a little green. Whoop, I got a little sable brush hair in there. So I'm adding a little green in here to kind of mix in with my blue. And anytime you don't like if you want a lighter pigment, dry your brush off, get a little more water and dry that brush off, and just pick up some of that pigment and move it through the water, okay? Or dab it with your paper towel, okay? So wherever it's darker, you can actually move. You can see I'm moving the color with my brush through the water. Okay, so watercolor is really all about how water and pigment mix, and the degree of which, you know, we have water versus the pigment. So it's all about playing with the amount of pigment versus the amount of water. Obviously, you get a more transparent look when you have more water, and when your brush and your paper are drier, you will have a much more pigmented, concentrated paint, okay? So that's really simple. This is the activity where, this is the example where we can add something kind of fun to it. So I'm adding a little more water just to let it bleed out a little bit more. And this is where we're actually gonna add the salt, if you have your salt nearby. You're gonna drop your salt right into, and then we're gonna have to let it sit, and we're gonna have to wait for the surprise. Okay, so let your salt sit in there. And you can already start to see that the salt is picking up some of the pigment in certain places. And you don't have to do this. If you enjoy your little wet on wet rectangle that you made, feel free to leave it like that. Okay, so I just want to do a quick check-in and on the chat, see how everything's going. Box 5 and 6. I think it looks like we got that. Getting precise and mixing color. Okay. Everybody doing okay so far? All right, so that was our wet on wet. Again, typically used for painting landscapes, simple skies, or soft watercolor washes. Gives a really flowy look. And it's really fun for kind of color mixing, and then also adding the salt, which we'll look at the end, and see how that turns out. Okay, so we're going to move on to wet on dry. Okay, this one is pretty straightforward. Wet on dry is simply starting with dry paper, picking up a small amount of paint with a wet brush, and beginning to brush it across the paper, and just playing with how much pigment you want to lay down versus how much water you want to lay down. Okay, so this might be used more for a solid background in a painting. It's also the technique we're going to use for the next box, which will be working on building up color and then creating gradients. So let's go ahead and go through that one. Okay, so I'm in my next box here, wet on dry. Okay, and I'm going to move some of my salt out of the way there. Again, I can use my medium-sized brush. Okay, so I'm going to go with my medium-sized brush here. I've dabbed my brush in a little bit of water. Okay, so I dab my brush in a little bit of water, and then I just dab it on my towel because I don't want it to be really, really wet like I had the wet on wet. Okay, and this time I am going to go for some purple to start with. And again, my purple paint is kind of a little bit dried up. So I am going to get actually a really concentrated pigment when I do this because my paint is really dry. It might also be what you get if you have a dried watercolor palette. Okay, so wet on dry is pretty simple. You're going to get a much more saturated pigment when you first lay it down. But you'll see as you move your brush and there's less and less water on the brush, your paint is going to start fading. But what's pretty cool is I don't have to get more paint on this brush. All I can do is simply dab a tiny bit the end in the water and go back to pushing this paint around. And if it's too transparent, I pick up a little more paint. Okay, so my paper is, in this example, has less water on it and more paint. So I'm not dabbing my brush in my water very frequently unless I'm changing colors. I just keep picking up color and laying that color down. And I try to just work with the water that's there because I want to make a more concentrated, pigmented background. So again, this can be used to fill in solid areas of a painting, to get color darker. So just to reiterate, this watercolor simply is, the concentration of water versus paint. And anytime you want something lighter, you use more water. And anytime you want something darker, you use less water. Okay, so that's a pretty straightforward one. Any questions on that?
Natalia raised her hand.
Okay.
See,
go ahead.
Natalia's, actually, hold on one second because I think I have to let her unmute. Okay, Natalia, you can now unmute yourself.
Oh, thank you. It's hard to type and try to do.
I know. So the raise hand function works better for sure.
I was wondering, so for wet on dry, are you applying it's wet brush to the paper first and then adding the color, or you're going watercolor paper?
I'm going a very small, let me show you again. I'll stop sharing this presentation and I'll show you overhead again. I know my water isn't in the picture, so that's part of the problem. So I am going small amount of water, so just a little bit of water. I even dab it on my towel, just a little bit, because I don't want a saturated brush. And then I'm picking up color. And then I'm laying it down. So I have dry paper, okay? So wet paint, so think wet paint on dry paper. Okay, this is wet paint on wet paper. So wet paint on dry paper. Okay.
Thank you so much. Yep, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just mention for any of you that want to use the raise hand feature, it's under your reactions button down at the very bottom of your screen if you move your mouse. You can click on that and you'll see options to raise your hand.
Okay. Oh, my presentation went away. Come back. There we go. Okay. So now we're going to look at building up color. So with building up color, we are practicing building up color from plain water, like we started. Okay, so we're kind of going sequentially here. We started with wet on wet, and now we're going to wet on dry. And now we're using both of those techniques to build up from a very transparent, very small amount of color to a more saturated paint mix. Okay, so we're just going to use one color for this. So you're going to choose one color that you want to work with. And you're going to start with just water. And I'm going to talk through the slide and then I'll show you the demonstration. So you're going to start with just a little bit of water on the brush. Lay some of that water down in the top half of your, or maybe the top sort of fifth of your rectangle. And then you're going to start gradually adding more paint. So this means you're not going to use as much water. So you're going to start with water and then you're going to back off the water. Okay. So we're playing a little bit here with an art element called value, the value of color, whether it's a lighter value or a darker, more saturated value. Okay. So let me share my overhead and we'll do a color build up here. Okay, so again, we are going to use a little bit of water. And I'm going to go ahead and lay some of that water down on the top, sort of like maybe fifth or sixth of my paper, okay, of that rectangle rather. Okay. And now I'm going to go in, I'm going to be using some red for this. So I'm going to go and get a little bit of red on my brush and I'm going to start just laying some of that red down here. And this is even a little more saturated than I want. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little more water, dab my towel, and just move some of that paint around a little bit because I want a very transparent look here. Okay. Now I'm gonna avoid going for any more. I'm gonna turn this down because it's really bright so you can't see what's going on. I'm gonna avoid going back to any more water. I'm just gonna go to paint. So I'm gonna add more paint and add more paint and more paint and more paint. So I'm not going back to my water at all. Okay. I started out with maybe just a little more pigment on my brush than I wanted. And I want to smooth this out a little bit now. So I'm going to go back and wash my brush out and just dab it on my towel a little bit. And I'm going to just kind of go slowly down through my gradient here, my buildup of color to blend everything a little bit more. Okay. So have a nice sort of rose, very light rose from white all the way up to the most saturated version of the color, okay? So less and less water as you go. If you find that you have too much water at the beginning, just dab that brush off and go back in. And if you feel like you have kind of lines in between that you want to smooth out a little bit more, you can just keep working your brush across that color. What happens is it drags the color down as you are working. So if you're working top to bottom like this, you know, the brush in watercolor, the brush drags the color with it, right? And then kind of deposits it. So you can just kind of play with how you want that gradient to look. And you can see that it's kind of smoothing out as I get closer to the top here. Okay, so that is building up color. Any questions on building up color so far? Again, the goal is not here for perfection here. You're just experimenting. It's the process of kind of playing with your watercolors and learning how they work. And, you know, if you don't like what's going on in a box, then get another piece of paper and try it on another piece of paper. The reason why I had us create boxes and label them is that so that you can you can go back and remember what you did there and what it's called, so that if you want to use that technique again as you learn more about watercolor, that you have that available to you. Okay, so now we're going to work a little bit with creating gradients. Okay, so gradients are working with two colors and gradually transitioning from one color to the other. All right, and we want to use colors for this example that are next to each other on the color wheel, and I'll go over that in just a minute. And the paint itself should be mixed to a 50-50. So I'm going to show you that in a minute too, okay? Meaning that if you have the tube watercolors, you're going to want to use a section of your palette to mix it with a little bit of water so that all you're working with is this 50-50 water paint mixture. You're going to go in with a slightly wet brush and pick up the first color and brush a bit. That was supposed to be on the rectangle, not the rectangle. And then pick up a bit of the second color and start to add that in, okay? So you're going to do just little by little, adding more and more of the second color until you transition from one to the other. Okay, so let me show you what that looks like. I know directions, and I'm a visual learner, so I can read that, but I need to watch somebody do it. So first of all, I want to just talk a little bit about, let me move this down so that you can see. It's bottom square. There we go. Okay, so you can see my creating gradients. First, I want to just talk a little bit about the color wheel. If you're not familiar with the color wheel, you can think of it as the rainbow, okay? And meaning that we want, when we work with the color wheel, we want colors that are next to each other in the rainbow or on the color wheel, okay? So here is actually a watercolor color wheel that I made. This was just a fun activity where I did an accordion fold with two pieces of paper, glued the, opened them up into a fan. So you had a fan, glued them together, and then made my own color wheel. So, and it actually just hangs on my wall. It's kind of a pretty little watercolor project that you could play with your, your different techniques that you learned today and try them out. So the rainbow is Roy G. Biv, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. And you can see that I even have kind of gradients in here, right? So a gradient would be moving from yellow to green. And you can see that even in this gradient, I have a little bit of green mixed in with my yellow, okay? So your two colors are gonna be, that you wanna choose right now, are gonna be next to each other on that color wheel. Okay, so for my purposes, I am gonna use orange and, let's see, do I want to use yellow? Yeah, I'm going to use yellow and orange. Now, in your kit, you did not receive an orange, but you did receive yellow and red. So if you want to, you're going to use a little bit of yellow. And here's where we're going to get into the color mixing a little bit. Okay. And I already have a red over here. So I want my yellow, but I also want to make it orange right here. So I'm going to pick up some of my yellow, lay it down in my palette. Okay. And then I want to go ahead and wash and dry my brush off before I pick up the red. Now I'm going to pick up some of the red paint. And I'm going to go in here and just mix myself a nice orange to work with. All right. So that's a good, pretty good 50-50 right there. It looks very spread out. It looks like nothing. But you'll see that the pigment is pretty concentrated and it will come off my brush and onto my paper quite thick, quite saturated. So I'm going to wash my brush off again because remember we want that 50-50. So I need to pick up a little bit more of my yellow. And I'm just going to go over here because I already have a little bit of yellow in this part of my palette. And I'm going to mix that up. And that's going to be the yellow, okay? So I'm not going straight out of the saturated color. I'm adding a little bit of water here so that I have, so you see how this is a 50-50 mixture versus 100% watercolor and plain water, okay? I know that it looks very transparent and spotty. That's because the palette is plastic, so it separates. It doesn't get absorbed by the palette, but it will actually be quite saturated. So my first color is going to be yellow. So I'm going to go ahead and take the yellow on my brush and I'm going to start at the top of my gradient with my yellow, top of my rectangle. This brush is shedding on me today. So I've got a little bit of yellow in there. Okay. And now without wet, I'm not going to wet or clean my brush again. I'm just going to go in and take some of this orange and I'm going to put this down below it. You can see that I have a little bit of yellow in there. It's kind of mixed in. And I'm going to pick up some more orange. And pick up some more orange until I get that little more saturated at the bottom. Now the color break is pretty significant. So between the two. So what I'm going to then do is go back with a little bit of water, wet my brush, and then dry it off, and then just start playing with blending this space in the middle, okay? You can see almost immediately I started to get a softer transition. So wet, dab my brush, too much water, you're gonna end up with puddles like our wet on wet example, okay? Now I feel like my orange is maybe going up a little too far, so I might go back in with some of my yellow and just play a little bit with bringing some of the yellow down into the orange, okay? And this is kind of fun to just try with different colors so that you get used to how colors interact with each other, okay? Because if you decide to start doing things that are a little more representative paintings versus abstract paintings, or even in your abstract paintings, it's good to play with creating gradients because as you shift from one color to the next, in watercolor you want a soft look. So you want to learn how to mix these colors next to each other and create that gradient and have it be a nice smooth transition. So it's good to do this with different colors on the color wheel. And you'll see I have an example of what that looks like. Just using, yellow to green, orange into red, and then kind of orange into sort of a pinkish, purplish color, kind of moving backwards on the color wheel. So think about a sunset. This would be a technique you might use for a sunset where you would have the various colors, from orange to yellow to red in a sunset kind of moving from one into the other. So that would be an example of how you would use this technique. Okay, how are we doing so far? It's so hard when I don't see people. I don't know if everybody's having fun.
No questions in the box here.
I'm going to take no questions as a good sign. And, you know, maybe just put a smiley face in the chat box if you're enjoying it.
Yeah, let's know if you're having fun.
Just so I know if everybody is getting the gist and having a good time. Okay. My whole thing about community is I like to see people, so it's really hard. You know, my community and art is, I like to see people's reactions to things, but with bigger groups, we got to do what we got to do. Okay, we are going to move on to getting precise. So I realize that this particular activity might be a little bit tricky to do in a small rectangle. So if you want to, go ahead and grab another piece of paper for a larger one if you want. What we're going to do, if you have them, is use a couple of different sizes of brushes. So I'm going to use the very smallest brush that I have, and then I'm going to use the medium size, either the round brush or a medium-sized flat edge brush. And I will show you in a minute what those look like. And the reason is because you're, you know, as getting precise implies, we're working with detail now, okay? And so you can see that the idea is to lay down some shapes of whatever kind are easiest for you to make on the paper, and then working with getting close to those shapes with our brushes and painting a little bit more precisely around those shapes, okay? So somehow that got cut off in my presentation, but with a different color, filling in around the shapes is our goal, okay? So I'm gonna show you what that looks like.
Julie, while you're switching, I just want to let you know we've had smiley faces, cat faces, thumbs up, and hearts since we asked if people are having fun.
Hey, okay, that's excellent. I love it. I love it. Okay. So let's move on to getting precise. Okay, so you can see my little getting precise box here. I am using a very small brush. I want to put these brushes next to each other so you can see. I'm still perfecting my light here in my studio for these presentations too. I realize I get shadows and stuff. So I work basically with these three different brushes for my watercolor. Okay, let's see if you can. So this was the rounder brush that I was using, the larger one that's sort of in the middle. This is a very fine tip brush. It's super small. I'm going to use that to create my small shapes. And this is what we call a flat edge brush. So you can see that it has this flat edge. And if I use it sort of on its side, I can really get up close to the edges of shapes. So I'm going to use, and again, you may not have all of these brushes, so you're going to just do the best with what you have, but now you'll know why there's different size brushes. I'm going to use the teeny tiny brush to create my shapes. I am going to fill in around the edges with this little flat brush, you'll see in a moment, and then to do the rest of the big background, I would use my larger brush. Okay, so I'm going to kind of repeat what I did before because I like the contrast of the black. I am not using very much water. I'm getting a lot of pigment on my brush for the black because I want very solid colors. And I had some difficulty with the circles before, so I think I'm going to stick with making some circles. So go ahead and create whatever simple shapes, because remember you're trying to work with getting around the edges. So I think I'll just do a nice polka dot pattern. I do not have that gold watercolor, but I am in the market for some gold and silver watercolor because I absolutely love that example that I used that has the gold and the navy blue. I just thought that was such a cool combination. So I'm always learning and finding new things that I love. So I'm just making my polka dots. I'm not going to go too crazy with this. Just making a couple more maybe.
Julie, do you want to talk about too, like where do you get your watercolor? So if folks want to expand their collection after this, where they might.
Yes. So as I mentioned, I really love the brand C.R.E.A.T.E. They make amazing. At the very end, I was going to go over a few other watercolor materials. So I'll try to save time for that. But if people can't, stay on for that long, Michael's is really pretty good. I have to say they've got a decent collection. They are not all artist grade. Okay. What you'll see is student grade and what we call professional or artist grade. I started out with student grade everything because it was less expensive and it was an easy way for me to learn how to use a material. But you'll find, and I tested this out, in the Target dollar aisle that we all know very well and love, they had a cute little set of watercolor tubes. Well, I tried to paint with them today, and no bueno. Okay, so not that it's terrible. I mean, but if you're frustrated with a material, it could be because of the quality of the material that you're using. Okay, so I go to Suave Fair. I go to Michael's. I order online from Blick Art Supply. And there's also Arlene's, which is down in Albany. So if you really want like a huge warehouse size kind of nice, you know, everything under the sun art supply store, take a little day trip down to Arlene's. Arlene's in Albany, and you'll have a blast in there. And then I will show you a few more at the very end. I'll show you a few more there's lots of interesting combinations of watercolors. There's watercolor pencils, there's watercolor crayons, there's various kinds of watercolor palettes. So you can really kind of go wild, and they all really interact pretty differently with water. So I have to say, it's not a one and done kind of thing. It's really pretty fun to, if you're into collecting art materials, to try things out. Okay, so I have some dots here on my paper. I'm just going to get a little bit of water on. Now, this is my flat edge brush. If you don't, use the smallest brush you have for this. And we're going to pick up some color to go around that. So I like the contrast of my yellow and my black, so I'm going to go with my yellow. And here's what I'm going to show you. I go around my shapes first, okay? So using either the flat edge or that real fine brush, you're just going to slowly go around your shapes. And if I'm using this flat edge brush, I turn my paper. It's easier than turning my hand. And I go up to the edge of the shape with the color, and then I pull it away. Okay? And you want to be careful, because if this isn't completely dry, even if it is, you're going to pull a little bit of that color with it. Okay, but that's kind of what watercolors are known for. It's rare that you have this kind of definition in a watercolor painting. I mean, kind of the point is to kind of have this very blended, flowy look. But again, I'm going to start out with a more saturated color, so I'm not using a lot of water right now. The more saturated, the more easily you can control the paint. So the more water you put on the brush, the more it's going to flow, and you're going to have a harder time controlling where the paint goes. So I'm using a pretty dry brush, and I'm using very concentrated paint right now. It's not mixed up with water like I had used previously in the gradient, okay? So with a very dry, saturated color brush, I'm just doing the edges.
So Julie, we did have a question about this. Is it possible to add an object after adding the second color?
So it is, but as you can imagine, once you could do a darker color over a lighter, okay? And you would want it to dry completely. You would want your first color to dry completely before you add the other object on top. But you would want that object to be darker. If you try to add a lighter color after, putting the background down. So in essence, the question is, can you do the reverse, lay down a background and then put an object? I'll show you what that looks like in the gradient while you're working on getting precise. It's a good question. Actually, let me show you on the wet on dry, because that's a very saturated, like if you did this kind of background and then we decided to put a color over. Let's say we put black over the top. So I'm going for high contrast if I'm going to put a color over the top. So and this isn't even the highest contrast, because the highest contrast would be yellow and black, right? So contrasts are the most opposite. So if I wanted to add an object on the top, again, I would want not very much water, and I would want a very saturated brush, but you'll see what happens. Actually, it's not coming through as easily as I still have a little bit of a purple background. So I'm going to dry my brush off a little bit more, pick up some of that black paint, and just kind of keep going over that object. So yeah, you can certainly do that, but watch, see how light this is? So I need not much water and a very saturated color to really lay an object down over a background. And I need high contrast, okay? So it would be easier to lay a black circle down over my yellow because you can't see through it as easily. That color is lighter in the background, easier to create a black dot. Okay, so yeah, certainly you can go in reverse. You're just going to be playing a little bit with, you know, the saturation of the color. But, you know, for this exercise, the point is more learning how to get precise and close up to objects, because if as you start painting in other, you know, if you start making other kinds of paintings that have objects, you are going to need how to control the color. You're going to want to know how to control the color around another object, okay? So the purpose of this is really learning that you want a very saturated color and not a lot of water next to whatever object you have laid down. Does that make sense? I hope. To whoever asked that question. I'm doing okay getting precise around it. So you'll see, let's say I use this big brush and I'm not getting very, you'll see I'm starting to drag the black in. Beauty of watercolor is if you take your little edge of your paper towel, if you catch it soon enough, you can usually go in and fix your mistake. And then go back in with, again, a very saturated brush with that color. Now I have a little extra black in there, so that didn't work as well as I'd hoped. More color, less water. Okay, and so then you would just use the bigger brush to fill in the bigger spaces. I'm trying to be cognizant of the time, so I want to go to the last slide. I'm not going to finish that. I want to go to our last slide for those of you that might have to end right at 7 o'clock. So, mixing color. Oh, I also added watercolor resist on here. That's a fun one, and I want to do that actually. So let's do this. Let me...
Julie, I'll just mention too, since we're recording this, if anyone does have to leave at 7, that I'll send out the recording when that's ready to everybody to sign up to.
Good point. Good point. Okay, I want to try to leave time for both of these. So I'm going to come back to watercolor resist. So I want to just do the mixing color real quick, and then I'll finish with the watercolor resist. So let's just go back to my, okay. So again, we're working with the color wheel, and what happens when you get some of the tube sets is that you'll notice that you won't have every color. Like for instance, we don't have orange. So we're gonna do a simple little exercise of color mixing. We want just a little bit of water on our brush, and we're gonna pick up red. I already have too much water on there. We're gonna pick up some red, very saturated red, and I'm gonna make a red dot up here. And I'm gonna wash my brush off, dry it. I'm gonna pick up some blue. Very saturated blue, very little water on my brush. And I'm gonna put that right next to it, kind of touching. Wash that brush out, dry it off, pick up some of my yellow. Okay, for those of you that may not remember this from your elementary school days, primary colors. Red, yellow, and blue. Okay. And now I'm going to go back with I'm going to rinse out my brush again. Really good. Dry it off so I have no pigment left on my brush. Okay. And I'm going to go in with a wet brush this time. And I'm going to drag the red and the blue back and forth. You'll start to see a little bit of orange forming in between. Rinse off my brush, dry, water. Drag a little bit of color between the red and the blue. And I get some purple over there. So the set that I put together the kits for the library does have a purple in it. But if you want to get, this is what I would call more of a periwinkle, right? The purpose of mixing colors is that the set that you get has the standard Pantone colors, and then we want to play a little bit with values and shades of those colors. So mixing can be really helpful for that, because you can start to get these different secondary colors and tertiary colors that come through by playing a little bit with color mixing. I also wanted to mention white, because white is one of those that is sort of tricky because we're typically painting on white watercolor paper. So I'm going to just show you really quick with white what you would do with that, because you do have a white in your kit. It's not opening up for me. Here we go. I have a child coming down the stairs, so.
Mother?
Saunders, I'm still in class. What's up, buddy?
I miss food.
Oh, dinner's right after this.
What is it?
Okay, so let me finish my class and we'll talk about dinner.
What is it?
Not sure yet. What are you cooking? Smash burger. Okay, I'm going to show you my white. What happens if I wanted to do a little bit of white? So I'm going to pick a very pigmented color. I just put a little tiny squeeze on my palette there. No water at all. And maybe I want some accents, to add. You'll see it in an example in a moment. Sometimes you would do this to add a little bit of shine if light is shining on one area or something of your painting. Okay, so you rarely do you mix the white with water. You usually use it as a more concentrated pigment. Okay, and you can see that I just added almost like a perspective of light to that blue, like light might be shining in on it. Okay, so white is always layered over the top of a darker color, almost always, I should say, and kind of used for highlighting purposes. All right. Color mixing. The last one is really fun. Color mixing is pretty straightforward. That's just kind of playing with the colors on the color wheel. Okay, last one. I'm just going to demonstrate this because if you don't have a crayon or something nearby, that's okay. I'm going to show you with a oil pastel as well as a white crayon. Crayon resist is really cool. It's kind of like when I taught preschool art in preschool, I called it magic painting because you can write a secret message and then have it revealed. So I'm going to write a little secret message in here. It's a little tricky because you cannot see what you're writing. So there's this trickiness here of getting just enough light so you can see what you're doing. Sometimes I like to just do kind of scribble drawings, and you'll see in a minute. I have an example where I'll just kind of do a scribble drawing. So that's with my crayon, and I'll show you with my oil pastels. We're going to be doing a pastel workshop with both dry chalk pastels and oil pastels next month. And up here, I'll just do a little scribble pattern so you can see the difference. Now I'm going to use my wet on dry method, okay? Actually, you could really use any method. You could use wet on wet or you could use wet on dry, okay? But I'm just going to use wet on dry. I'm going to get, because my paper is dry, I'm not going to lay down any water yet. I'm going to get some water on my brush, dab it just a little bit. I'm going to use some green this time. So I have kind of a maybe 50-50, half water, half paint. And I'm just going to wash over the top of that. Maybe add a little water as I go, just start spreading it out. And I love color mixing, so I'm gonna pick up some purple and go in with some purple now. You'll see my secret message as I get, oops, got some brown. So I'm just doing a really simple wet on dry, pretty saturated. You'll notice that my paper's starting to curl up. So one thing I didn't mention at the start of the class is if that's happening to you, you can tape the edges of your paper down with painter's tape. There is actually a sort of artist grade painter's tape that looks like masking tape, but it does what painter's tape does. If you're not familiar, this is painter's tape. It's blue. It's what house painters use to tape off so that they can do precise details, but it will hold your paper down. It will eventually flatten back out, but because of the water, while I'm laying this down on a larger piece of paper with a lot of paint and water, it's starting to roll up on me a little bit. So do you see my secret message? So that's kind of fun. You'll see that the oil is a lot more of a subtle, you can almost barely see. I just did kind of little swirlies in here. It's a much more subtle resist than the wax. Okay, so crayon is wax and oil pastel. So, I mean, they both resist water, but the crayon is much more effective at getting a real, like if you're going to do kind of a message like this across, you know, it's much more effective at doing that. But as you keep going, you can see that I'm starting to lose a little tiny bit of my message. So anyway, that's kind of a fun little multimedia with your watercolor. And again, you can see how my paper is curling. You can tape it down with masking tape. So you would just tape off the edges like this in a rectangle and would hold your paper down. But this will, once it dries, it'll dry flat. So for instance, my crayon resist that I did earlier today, it curled up big time, but now it's flat. So you can see I used oil pastel on this one. It's much more subtle. Okay, so it would just kind of be creating sort of subtle resist backgrounds. Okay, I want to go back and just show you, if you haven't done salt, what happens with the salt if you didn't do the salt. And if you have, go ahead and get your rectangle back out. We'll see how well it works. Sometimes it shows a little bit better, shows up a little bit better on a larger painting, but it's not even quite dry. So I'm just going to do this right now. Get some of the salt off. But over time, it will dry. Sometimes it sticks on there. And it's not even, I think you'll wake up maybe tomorrow morning and take your salt off. What you'll see is you get these areas where the salt has grabbed the color and absorbed the water and the color and left behind a cool little sort of almost shimmery dot where the salt was. So you're going to brush once this is totally dry, and it's not yet. So once this is totally dry, you can brush it all the way off. I didn't do an example of that earlier because I forgot. I decided to leave it at the last, added at the last minute. So yeah.
Julie, if you like the texture, like if you want to put some texture into your work like that, do you know, like, could you like Mod Podge over it or use some kind of sealant to actually keep the salt on there?
Well, you know what? I think that when you do it, you'll see that the texture will be left behind, but I see what you're saying is if you actually want that salt on there. You know, that's a good question. I've never tried to do Mod Podge over the top. I would not suggest Mod Podge over the top of watercolor because it will pick up the watercolor. Anytime you put more water down on the dried surface, it will pick up the color again and move it around. So if you want to seal watercolor in some way, I would use really cheap, like Aquanet hairspray, or I'll show you something. This is something I'm going to suggest in our pastel class. Let me just grab it. At the art store, this is pretty toxic, so I would take it outside. That's why when I do this with kids, I go to the dollar store and I just get Aquanet, and I get the fragrance-free kind. But you can get a fixative. Okay, so this is any kind of fixative that you can use for pastels, but because pastels are dry and kind of like dry watercolors, this will fix watercolor as well. So you would spray that over the top. I don't know if it would really keep the salt on. I haven't tried that before, but it's worth a shot. But if you use Mod Podge, just know that it's going to pick the color back up again, and it's going to move your color around. Okay, because watercolor is very zen like that. It's impermanent. So to make it permanent, you have to fix it with some sort of spray fixative that isn't going to move the color around too much, and you got to spray from a distance with it.
Great. Yes, and I'll just mention a few comments that have come in. Cindy said it looks like an asteroid splash and it sparkles. And we've had several people say how much they've been enjoying the program, and how it's helping to, de-stress as well.
Yes. Yeah. So let me just mention that, and I didn't say this at the beginning, but watercolors is my favorite relaxing art activity. And that's why I tend to do kind of abstract art, because abstract watercolors, because the precision part kind of makes me a little stressed out. But it's also cool if you want to learn, how to make watercolor paintings that are a little more realistic and have objects in there that you would want to know how to do that. So I'm so glad to hear that that's relaxing, because this is one of my favorite stress reducing activities is to do watercolor like this. So I'll just finish up with a couple of other materials that you might want to go out and find and play with. Watercolor pencils are really fun. They look exactly like a colored pencil. Looks like my internet's not too stable. So with this, and I do just want to do a quick example. I've done this in my other classes. I just want to show you what a couple of these different supplies look like. Okay, so for instance, I'm going to just do my screen share really quick while you guys are playing. I'm going to use my watercolor pencils here. Watercolor pencils will lay down like a watercolor, so it's going to be very saturated. Again, remember that watercolor is about your balance of color to water. And I often like doing those gradient exercises with my watercolor pencils. So I've got the two watercolor pencils next to them. I'm going to show you another fun little tool that I have. Okay, so I've laid down my watercolors next to each other. I think I'm going to add a little more orange on the side of this. And I'm going to show you another fun little tool you can find if you like to travel and do watercolors. This is a travel brush. It has water in the tip, so you unscrew. This way you don't have to carry around a bottle of water. So you unscrew, you pour a little bit of water in, screw the top back on, and they do come in different size brush tips. You need to squeeze a little bit of water out first. So I usually do this over my towel. I squeeze a little water out till I see that it's flowing through the brush. Okay, and then you can go right over the top of your watercolor pencils and then just squeeze as you need more water. Now, obviously, it's not quite as forgiving as having water and a brush that you can dab, but it serves the purpose if you want to travel or do this outside and you don't want to have to drag around a bottle of water with yourself for so these are really, really, really fun. I use these all the time when I travel. Okay, so that's a watercolor pencil. Again, here's my Sakura kit, which I love. I know Jen is a big fan of these too. The Sakura kit has the palette built right in, and this comes, you've got every number of combinations of colors. So this is these are dry block watercolors, so you have to add water, but you can mix down here, you can mix in your palette. And when I travel, this is what I bring, because it has the little sponge to dry, although I often need a paper towel or something too. This is my travel kit right here. So I have a small little watercolor tablet that I bought, and this, and when I go on trips, especially to the beach or mountains or outside, I like to create with the colors around that I see. And I'll show you one more fun tool. This is like a watercolor crayon. It's called C.R.E.A.T.E. I showed this to my visual journaling class last time. So they kind of look like an oil pastel or a crayon, but they turn into watercolor. So on this half of the paper, I'm just going to do, let's do some green. And again, the more you saturate and, the heavier you press on your water or your crayon, the more saturated color you're going to get. And now with my big brush and a lot of water, I'm going to start moving this around. So it's just really kind of fun to play with all these different materials and see how they all interact differently with water and paper. They're really all very different. And I love color mixing and doing gradients with pencils and these watercolor crayons. I just find that they turn out so cool when you're playing with colors next to one another like that. So, so those are really fun extra watercolor, tools to check out.